All right, Diane. Welcome to the 9:30 call. Diane and Kim, I will turn things over to you.
Terrific. Thanks so much. I'm also here with my colleague, Elly Miles. And as you mentioned, Amy, this is Connecting the Dots. We're really focused on infrastructure for connecting services for families with young children throughout the Commonwealth. So the next slide gives a brief hello to everyone. And we know it's an hour earlier, and last night were the Academy Awards. So we hope everyone's enjoying the sunshine, and just wanted to acknowledge that it is an hour earlier, and hopefully folks aren't exhausted because of that. The next slide just gives an overview. We're going to be quick. I'm going to turn it over to Elly in a moment, as well as Kim Lucas. We're going to tell you who we are, why we conducted this research, how we scoped it, what we did, who we heard from, what we learned, what we found, and then also what's next. So again, our team, we've had a great team from both Urban Institute, and I know many of you are familiar with our organization. We're based in Washington, D.C., but I'm actually, I've been living in Massachusetts for the last 30 plus years. So our main headquarters is in DC. We are a research advocacy, not advocacy, we're a research, nonpartisan research organization. So last week, when we heard from the Agenda 6 folks, it was really terrific to hear the passion and to hear how you're taking these topics and advocating and moving forward. Our presentation, we're hoping, will be interesting, but it might be a bit more dry because, again, we're nonpartisan research organization. We're going to tell you why we conducted the research, how we scoped it, what we did, and who we and what we learned from our landscape review. So our next slide shows our team. We actually, you probably recognize the name Jonah Norwood and Justin Doramel as well. And they have been instrumental. We've had a whole team of folks behind us. But the key folks who have been working on this project are myself, Kim Lucas, who's with Northeastern, Elly Miles, and Eve Mefford. And you'll see our names on the various products and reports. The next slide shows, we want to acknowledge our funders, the Commonwealth Children's Fund, who have provided a grant to support the work and have been part of our steering committee. The next slide shows who's on our steering committee, and this is actually many of you who are here today. We want to thank you and acknowledge your contributions. We presented our overall approach, some of the instruments those are the interview protocols and focus group protocols, our design and preliminary findings to make sure that we got insights into the context and that we were interpreting what we heard correctly within the context of what's happening here in the Commonwealth and throughout different parts of the state. So special shout out and thanks to our steering committee. The next slide shows why we conducted this research. So we have used the term infrastructure, and a lot of people are very confused by that term. They think that that means roads and bridges, but we started to conduct this research to identify not only what the current conditions are, but what some of the promising efforts are for improving families' access to early childhood services, to strengthen the policies, systems, and funding so that ultimately we could develop recommendations about the best way to invest in a robust and coordinated early childhood system. Or at the time, we thought maybe multiple systems. We know that currently each of the sectors are very fragmented, but the idea was to coordinate the various early care and not just early care and education, but early childhood systems. And Kim is going to present our recommendations, and Elly in one moment is going to describe the landscape review. Some of you might be thinking, well, wait a minute. Eve and the Agenda 6 team are conducting a landscape review, and we're super pleased that they're going deeper and really taking what we began with for our landscape review and looking at specific promising models and approaches. We focused specifically on initiatives that directly support families, access and coordination. So we also looked at initiatives designed to streamline the direct delivery of services through coordinated approaches. We acknowledge the importance of different approaches that exist. And in fact, we got recommendations that some of these approaches are needed. For example, state level coordination, regional networks, or provider level coordination. With that said, those were not the focus of our landscape review. Instead, the next slide shows that we looked at over 50 initiatives, and we heard from over 100 people throughout the state. The next slide shows, this is not to indicate that there is an relative emphasis or that the early care and education is more important. The size of these bubbles reflect the number of people we spoke with within each one of these buckets, acknowledging the importance of all of these. So we heard from representatives from all, and many people we talked to, even within early care and education, also provide coordinated services. So for example, people working in Head Start or Early Head Start also work on, obviously, the whole range of comprehensive services. So the next slide shows that we developed two important reports. The first that Elly is going to talk about, again, I highlighted the landscape review in blue. The other main report, it pulls together the recommendations from the landscape review and from all of you who we heard from. We have a number of supplementary documents, including a 2-page summary, a blog that really provides a nice vignette that Elly is going to elaborate on in a moment, and testimony that we delivered that really emphasizes one of our key recommendations. And we will be continuing to work not only with folks like you all, but briefing the folks from the General Assembly and people throughout the state on these findings. So we anticipate additional products as we produce these various presentations. The next slide now, I'm going to turn over to Elly, and she's going to highlight what we heard in our landscape report.
Great. Thanks so much, Diane, and good morning, everybody. So glad to be here today. So like Diane mentioned, the first step that we took in this process before seeking to make recommendations was to try to understand what families were experiencing and what the coordinated approaches out there look like, and how they're structured to streamline and make the system easier to navigate for parents. So I want to just encourage you, as we get started this morning, to think with me about some of the questions that we were thinking about as we began to undertake this work. So I'd like you to bring to mind a parent you know, maybe a parent that you work with, that's a little worried that maybe their child has an unaddressed developmental problem. They're not really sure where to go, though, and they're very short on time. Given what you know about our early childhood infrastructure, what challenges might that parent face when they're trying to navigate services? Perhaps that parent that you've brought to mind works the night shift. Maybe they don't speak English as their primary language. Perhaps that parent's worried about other big life challenges that they're dealing with at the same time. Perhaps they're working multiple jobs. Perhaps they don't have flexibility. Perhaps they don't have a car to get around. And how do parents in that situation get their child screened? Who would be their first stop for support? Where would they meet someone that would connect them to needed services? One story that we heard about was a mother named Mia. She had moved to Western Massachusetts recently with her infant and her toddler, and was struggling with some social isolation. She was kind of alone. She had no idea where to begin to build community or to get connected to preschool, childcare, or other supports. And one day she walked into the local library, and she was incredibly fortunate to meet someone there named Michelle, who she thought was a librarian. And Michelle connected her with play groups. She got to meet other moms. Her toddler started attending the story time at the library, and Michelle shared information with her about the free local public preschool program. After a period of time building relationship, Michelle suggested that Mia's preschooler might benefit from being checked for language development. And not only did Michelle share that information with her, Michelle also walked her through getting to the service, getting evaluated, getting checked, and ultimately enrolling. Previously, Mia had no idea that her daughter had a language delay, and her trip to the library had in some ways been a really amazing and welcome surprise that had supported her in building community and finding help. What Mia also didn't know at the time was that Michelle was not a librarian. She was a grant-funded coordinator whose role was to meet parents, build relationships, and connect them to resources. And so I want to pause there for just a quick moment and ask you in the chat, if you'd like to contribute and think about this, who are the connectors in your community that support and link diverse families? And where do families find those connectors?
Do you want folks to put that in chat or come alive?
I think the chat would be great if you'd like to share a little bit in there as we keep going. And I'm going to also just pop that question in the chat for everyone. I'm going to keep going, but just encourage you to be reflecting on that, because these are the people that really make such a big difference in supporting families, especially families that are facing added stressors or vulnerabilities and may need support navigating a system. So those questions really inspired our work with the first report. Like I noted, we wanted to understand how families are gaining connections to needed services in the Commonwealth. Where are they finding connectors? Are connections made by co-locating services? Are they made by linking parents between services? Who builds the relationship with the parent? How's their support structured? Those were some of the things we were thinking about. And like Diane mentioned, our search led to the identification of 58 initiatives and partnerships that were focused on building connection. More than half of them were operating at 5 or more sites across the state. And do encourage you to read the report so you can get more details on what those initiatives were. But just to give you kind of a high level flavor, connectors met families in all kinds of ways, all kinds of locations. They met families in their home, in the doctor's office, at childcare drop-off, in libraries like we talked about, even in neighborhoods through peer support programs. And connections across services were also commonly supported by structural decisions that were made, like by co-locating services in the same place. And I think what's apparent from this map is that there are some regions in the state where there are many more initiatives and partnerships available to help parents navigate and to support them. And in contrast, there are some regions around the state where the availability of those supports is much more sparse, especially in more rural regions. So we wanted to understand how efforts to improve coordination of services for parents were structured, and found that by far it was most common for programs to be offering direct services of some sort to families while also making an effort to link them and connect them to other services that they might need. One kind of salient example of that most of us are familiar with would be Head Start, where they're providing high quality early care and education experience while also employing a whole staff that is focused on supporting families, assessing their needs, and linking them to a range of comprehensive supports. There were a smaller number of programs we found that only served to be navigators or connectors in the system, and some that really just focused on linking and bringing together supports for families and weren't as focused on linking them externally to other supports. We also found that while some initiatives just share information at a high level and then are looking for parents to sort of take that information and act on it themselves, most initiatives actually are providing more intensive and what we would consider relationship-based support. They are over time working with parents. They're meeting with them repeatedly, often setting goals, providing warm handoffs. They're doing that relationship-based work that we know is really powerful for engagement. And then lastly, we wanted to talk a little bit about how these coordination approaches are structured, and what, after we had sort of gathered and learned what it was that we kind of recommended might be an ideal way to make sure that parents are not falling through the cracks in the system, or through the gaps. So we found that many programs were working to assess families' needs and link them to needed services through what we would consider a no wrong door approach. So you come into my service, I'm going to connect you to another service that you need. It doesn't really matter which one of those services you entered. You're going to get where you need to go. At other times, we found programs that tried to break down barriers by co-locating supports, which, you know, really supports families that maybe have transportation challenges and limited time, that when they show up somewhere, they're going to get evaluation and support for several things at once. And sometimes we found programs doing both. So ultimately, when thinking about how to offer the most comprehensive, coordinated support for families, we recommended an approach to building connection that centralized, you can see that in yellow, centralizes as many services as possible to reduce the family's burden in accessing supports and connections. And then that program could also be, in some ways, a hub to refer out to other services. Those would be the black boxes, A, B, C. Those services, though, could also act as a safety net. They find families. They act as that no wrong door entry point, and they can also direct families back to that centralized hub to get co-located supports if they don't offer those particular supports, and continue to link families amongst one another. So in that way, families that begin with the hub and families that enter the system through separate standalone services can ultimately be funneled back into the same system of supports, and no family gets left behind in that process. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause there, and I'm going to turn it over to Kim.
Okay, so I'm going to walk everyone through our findings and then the correlated recommendations that we have. And so the first big finding is the big finding, and then we've got 5 smaller findings that are kind of underneath this big finding. So the first one is a little bit obvious, right? I think there's a need for families with children, with young children, to do 2 things: obtain information and get connected to early childhood services of all types. And so what that means and what that looks like overarching is that we really just need more support to build this coordination, build this alignment, and that looks like legislation, that looks like investment, because folks have to do this work. This is a relationship-based kind of work. And so people capacity is needed to be able to do it, and we need that funded, which is a wild thing in light of the C3 cuts folks are talking about. And I think we should really think about, how do we incorporate this into larger asks? How do we incorporate this into budget asks? And what does this look like for advocacy? The second thing, so moving on to the smaller types of findings and recommendations, is that from the experience of families, right, they experience a patchwork of services. And so what that means is their experience of a patchwork of services, they cannot easily move through and across different services that they might need to navigate, or they might learn that they need to navigate. And so this is just further emphasis for that coordination, for that alignment of those existing initiatives. And paired with that is this finding that a formal state role, because we don't really have strong regional roles, so a formal state role, we think, can be really valuable in supporting that coordination, in supporting that alignment. And we're really looking to interagency, state level leadership to come through. We're already seeing that at the state level with the governor's executive order, but I think that, we're on that pathway. We can do much more, and the devil will be in the details, right? Like, how do we actually do that coordination? How do we actually push forward and make sure that the experience, finding number 2, is not a patchwork and that it feels seamless for families? On the next slide. The next thing that we want to talk about is really understanding the infrastructure components at the local level. So just because there's a state coordinating body doesn't mean that the state should bear the burden of doing everything. The folks we talk to from across the state come from different needs, different challenges, and you all know this. And so there is an important piece where locally any type of next step needs to be tailored, and we need to create a space for innovation and flexibility on the local level to be sure that the folks who are in each region, in each part of the state, are actually getting the things that they need and tackling the challenges that they're experiencing. Finally, I think two things. The folks are also not aware of many of the initiatives that exist. So similar to Elly's story about the parent who, wandered into the library and then learned about a host of things that she could tap into, there needs to be some level of awareness and branding directly to families so that they can understand the range of things that are available to them. And again, this is going to vary locally. And then finally, I think we're looking at the role of philanthropic and business engagement, which is, I think, a really interesting thing that has bubbled up from the folks we talked to. Understanding that it takes a village, right? Like understanding that it's not just the state, it's not just your local agencies and your local governments, but it's truly everyone who needs to come together to innovate and think differently about how this coordination, how these alignments can come together, can provide that seamless feeling and experience for families so that they get what they need. And I'll turn it back to Diane.
I know we're getting down to the wire. So in the last minute, I did want to just, the next slide we have a couple of quotes, and I know Amy's really terrific about sharing the slides. A lot of these quotes are in our various products. And the final, this slide shows the names of our various products. And the final slide is to let everyone know that we haven't yet met our goal of actually achieving a coordinated system. But to Kim and Elly's point, there are opportunities to share the findings in the various ways that folks can communicate the importance of these issues. We put the landing page in the chat. We will share broadly. We're looking to communicate these through a variety of channels, and opportunities exist for everyone who's part of this 9:30 call to continue to work with the Agenda 6 work group to identify the most promising elements. So we started this effort, and we're handing it over to Eve, Kim, and our team. And we really want to thank everyone for the continued work. We recognize that we've done a lot, but we've just started to lay out a framework, and there's more work that's needed. Our next slide really thanks everyone. Not only those of you who have informed our work, but everyone who's involved in this important work. And we are really grateful to everyone's commitment to providing services. So with that, the very last slide is, again, thank you so much to everyone for the terrific work that you are doing. And please reach out with any questions or any opportunities to share the materials that we've put together.
Thank you so much to Diane and Kim and Elly for sharing this. I think this is like the dream of the early childhood agenda, to bring all the work collectively together to think about next steps, to really understand what's happening currently. And we really appreciate the two-parter. Diane has already sent me the slides, so you will find the slides from last week from work group 6, and then we'll post the slides from today on the follow-up call. Thank you so much for joining and for giving us a little bit of time in the beginning for those quick announcements. I know every minute counts here in the 9:30 call. As we said, this Thursday, we have the 9:30 call at night. We also have, I put in the chat this week, so we have Listen to Your Mothers coming tomorrow, the Senate President coming Wednesday, and then Commissioner Kershaw will join us on Thursday. There is also an EEC board meeting in Boston And there's always an opportunity there to share public comment. So we'll encourage folks to do that. And then next Monday, stay tuned for our exciting announcement about the 9:30 call 4th year anniversary. Thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you for keeping the chat going. Diane, I'll also send you the chat. It was full of good information. And please, please, please make sure that we are all continuing to stick together through the next few months and beyond. We will see you tomorrow morning on the 9:30 call. Take care.